welcome to Ticker Climate. My name's Holly Stearns. It's lovely to have you tuning in every single week for this important and ongoing discussion. Now on Ticker Climate, we tackle the climate crisis facing our planet, and then we examine what actions governments and corporations need to take. Now my co-host Scott Hamilton is a climate change and energy expert and joins me now. Scott, lovely to see you as always.
Hello, Holly. Terrific to see you today.
Now, Scott, I thought we'd start a conversation with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Now, they actually attended and they took part in the Global Climate Citizens event in New York. They were calling for stronger action by all global leaders on climate change. We actually saw our very own Australian Delta Goodrum and Kylie Minogue as well as Elton John. What did you make of the event?
It was really quite a huge event, and it was all across the world. So it was one of those massive concerts that had concerts in New York and LA and in London, everywhere, and all the really biggest names were there. And it was really clear what the message was to the world leaders. They need to act much quicker and stronger on climate change. And they also need to act quicker and stronger on vaccination, and particularly of those developing nations. So those poorer countries, Harry and Meghan were both very concerned about the impacts of COVID on those nations and also climate change. So that was a really strong message. And it was terrific to see just the numbers of people which are just engaged in this debate. I haven't seen this in many, many years, Holly.
Yeah, and it's lovely to have people at that level and that stature actually come forward and signify and speak up and say that climate change is a problem, and also looking out for those smaller people as well who are being impacted by climate change as well. Now, we also saw the UN General Assembly sessions gather in order to drive critical climate action ahead of the COP26 climate meeting in Glasgow in November. Now, what have you seen in regards to this?
Yeah, so once again, this was really the United Nations Secretary General and this session really trying to drive critical action in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow, which is coming up in November. It's only a number of weeks away. So they were really trying to, I think, rev everyone up to get moving. And this includes people like President Biden, as well as Prime Minister Boris from the UK. The other thing which I found really fascinating or really important and really quite sad was I was listening to one of the presentations by the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, which is a small island state, and they were essentially saying that they've got about an average level above sea level in terms of the elevation of that island, of about 2 metres. And we know that climate change is already going to increase sea levels by 1 metre. And it also means that there's massive storm surge, which means that these islands just get decimated. So we talk about these massive countries, and there was the Quad meeting as well, which we might talk about. But this is really a case of a country that's going to lose their home. So this is really huge, and it's really a message to all countries and all nations. You need to step up to look after these people and these countries and these nations.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you've made there, because often we always talk about the big players, right? The US and China and Australia even is up on that level. But we don't talk about the other smaller countries that are being impacted by climate change. Is their voice getting heard, Scott?
Yeah, look, sadly not. And in fact, I can remember very similar presentations and pleas 10 and 20 years ago. And I recall even when Malcolm Turnbull was at Paris in 2015, it was a long while ago now, there were very similar pleas. And the problem is we've just continued to increase our emissions, and now time is really running out. So it's no longer a 2050 timeframe that we need to have action, serious action by, it's 2030. And in the meantime, these island states are getting decimated, just getting smashed.
Yeah. It's very sad, isn't it? Now, moving on to the Quad meeting that you spoke about briefly, this is where leaders from the US, Japan, India and Australia met. Now, climate was a big focus there. What do we know? What are the key takeaways?
Yeah, look, I think that this was really a case of all of those countries, although putting the pressure on Australia. And it was really telling that the word climate crisis was mentioned a number of times in the communique coming out of that meeting. And we haven't heard Prime Minister Morrison use those words before, so it'll be fascinating to see whether he does in the next little while. But they were clearly, these leaders were saying there is a climate crisis and we need to move quickly. And that's really put the pressure back on Scott Morrison in Australia, and there's been recent lots of debate between the Liberal Party and the National Party in particular about whether they're going to commit to net zero by 2050. Now, I actually think it will be welcome, but I don't think that's going to be enough.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, just following on from that, there are also speculations and reports suggesting that Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison might not even attend the COP26 climate summit in November in Glasgow, which is quite concerning as well. We've seen more heat put on Australia to lift its climate action game, with a lot of debate centering around emission targets and coal throughout Australia.
Yeah, that certainly is, and it's quite remarkable. Like we just, over the recent times, saw Morrison reaching out to both President Biden as well as Boris in terms of the nuclear sub-deal. Now, you would think that he would therefore see the importance that those two leaders are putting on climate change and make the effort to go to Glasgow. It really is telling that he is equivocating, that he's not really serious about climate action, because it's the actions that are what really count. It's not how much you can maybe spin things or else convince people that we're going to meet and beat our targets. Well, they're actually really poor targets, and in fact our emissions are going up. So I actually think that he might be worried that if he goes to Glasgow that they might not give him a speaking slot, or he will get what they call the Fossil of the World award, Holly. So each day generally the environment groups at these meetings award what they call the Fossil Award, which is for the country that's being the biggest blocker or the biggest laggard when it comes to climate action. And he might be worried about getting that if he turns up.
Scott, we also caught up with Richie Merzian from the Australia Institute earlier. Take a listen to what his thoughts are on Australia holding on to coal production.
UK COP president saying, let's consign coal to history. And you have the Australian government saying, we're going to bring out new subsidies for coal. This is on top of the $10.3 billion per year that Australian governments commit to subsidising fossil fuel usage in Australia already. Now there's a new one to keep Australia's coal clunkers online. And let's remember, Australian coal power stations are old, they're unreliable, and they're expensive. They also don't meet the needs of a flexible grid that needs to meet those peaks and troughs, which is what we're seeing more and more. So it's unsuitable to what we need, and it's also getting older and older and more unreliable. Yes, the best thing the Australian government could do is actually come up with a plan for how to retire its coal-fired power stations, which is something that most Australians support as well.
Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
Look, Richie is exactly right there. And that's again, like it's really, let's not get distracted by this talk about the net zero by 2050, whether they're going to commit to it or not. The real question is, where's your plan to phase out coal-fired power stations and fossil gas in an orderly and timely way? Where's your plan to get to 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, because that's what the climate needs if we're going to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. And that's what other leaders around the world are doing. And if we don't do this, Australia is going to be whacked with tax and tariffs, and people won't be buying our products. So we really need to get serious, and we need to be focused on 2030.
It's also really important as well. The coal industry does give thousands of people jobs right across Australia, big coal towns. It's also important for them to have a plan as well, so they know what they are doing and they can financially plan for the future as well when we do eventually phase out of coal. In regards to big opportunities in Australia, though, there's lots of talk about green steel, Scott.
Yes, look, and again, we talked about the Quad meeting, which happened in the last few days. And one of the big messages coming out of that meeting, and particularly from India, was the demand for green steel made from green hydrogen. So hydrogen that's made from solar and wind power, not from coal and not from fossil gas. And that's going to be the future. And it's great. These are our major trading partners that are sending this signal to Australia that the days of coking coal being used for steel are numbered. So we need to move, and we need to move in towards green steel. And there was also some fascinating research that was coming out of the University of New South Wales in the last couple of weeks, Holly, and that was saying that they can actually use recycled batteries and mobile phones and computers and e-waste as part of the process for replacing the need for coal. So they'd use things like old tyres and those things in the blast furnace rather than coking coal. So really, this is the future, and we've got a great opportunity. We just need to embrace it and start moving.
Scott, really important conversations today. I'm really glad that we've covered everything in regards to the lead up to COP26 as well. Finally, today is actually World Rivers Day, a day for the celebration of our rivers and waterways, but also a day for remembering how fragile they are as well, which is very critical. Now, Scott, you are having your book Sold Down the River launch tomorrow with your co-author Stuart Kells. Now, the launch will be hosted by Tim Flannery from the Climate Council as well. Tell us why this book is so critical and important right now, and what is the impact of climate change on the Murray-Darling Basin River, which is an iconic in Australia?
Sure, Holly, and we are thrilled to have Tim Flannery actually host the launch of the book, who's really a leader in climate action, part of the Climate Council, and he's really seen the work that we've done in Sold Down the River, which is really looking at the water market, but also looks at the impacts of climate change on the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, we've had some relief in recent years in recent months with a little bit of rain, but over the last 20 years, there's been about half the amount of inflows into the Murray-Darling Basin as the previous century. So that's an enormous reduction in the amount of water, and that's going to get further reduced by climate change over the next 10 years. So we need an effective plan and an effective water market to make sure we're sharing this water in the best way to look after the farmers, to look after the environment, to look after the First Nations and the other water users. And it's not currently working, and really our book shines a light on why it's not working, and we need to take drastic action, or we'll be just we will continue to decimate our most important natural resource, which is the Murray-Darling Basin.
Yeah, a very, very important book, Scott. Congratulations to all of you on that. Scott, that is all we have time for today on Ticker Climate. Thank you, as always, for your time. Really great to see you. We'll catch up with you next week.
No worries, Holly. Great to see you again.
And remember, you can head to tickeroriginals.co for all sorts of discussions from climate, travel, crypto, and more. My name's Holly Stearns. Thank you for your company.